The Mariposa Bank Mystery by Stephen Leacock. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by valroth. The Mariposa Bank Mystery by Stephen Leacock. Suicide is a thing that ought not to be committed without careful thought. It often involves serious consequences, and in some cases brings pain to others and oneself. I don't say there is no justification for it. There often is. Anybody who has listened to certain kinds of music, or read certain kinds of poetry, or heard certain kinds of performances upon the concertina, will admit there are some lives which ought not to be continued, and that even suicide has its brighter aspects. But to commit suicide on grounds of love is at the best a very dubious experiment. I know that in this I am expressing an opinion contrary to that of most true lovers, who embrace suicide on the slightest provocation as the only honorable termination of an existence that never ought to have begun. I quite admit that there is a glamour and a sensation about the thing which has its charm, and that there is nothing like it for causing a girl to realize the value of the heart that she has broken, and which breathed forgiveness upon her at the very moment when it held in its hand the half-pint of prussic acid that was to terminate its beating forever. But apart from the general merits of the question, I suppose there are a few people outside of lovers who know what it is to commit suicide 4 times in 5 weeks. Yet this is what happened to Mr. Pupkin of the Exchange Bank of Mariposa. Ever since he had known Zena Pepperleigh, he had realized that his love for her was hopeless. She was too beautiful for him and too good for him. Her father hated him and her mother despised him. His salary was too small and his own people were too rich. If you add to that he came up to the judge's house one night and found a poet reciting verses to Zena, you will understand the suicide at once. It was one of those regular poets with a solemn jackass face and lank parted hair and eyes like puddles of molasses. I don't know how he came up there, up from the city probably, but there he was on Pepperleigh's veranda that August evening. He was reciting poetry. Either Tennyson's or Shelley's or his own, you couldn't tell. And about him sat Zena with her hands clasped, and Nora Gallagher looking at the sky, and Jocelyn Drone gazing into infinity, and a little tubby woman looking at the poet with her head falling over sideways. In fact, there was a whole group of them. I don't know what it is about poets that draws women to them in this way. But everybody knows that a poet is only to sit and saw the air with his hands and recite verses in a deep, stupid voice, and all the women are crazy over him. Men despise him and would kick him off the veranda if they dared, but the women simply rave over him. So Pupkin sat there in the gloom and listened to the poet reciting Browning, and he realized that everybody understood it but him. He could see Zena with her eyes fixed on the poet, as if she were hanging on to every syllable. She was. She needed to. And he stood it just about 15 minutes, and then slid off the veranda and disappeared without even saying good night. He walked straight down Oneida Street and along the main street just as hard as he could go. There was only one purpose in his mind: suicide. He was heading straight for Jim Elliott's drugstore on the main corner, and his idea was to buy a drink of chloroform and drink it and die right there on the spot. As Pupkin walked down the street, the whole thing was so vivid in his mind that he could picture it to the remotest detail. He could even see it all in type, in big headings in the newspaper of the following day. "Appalling suicide. Peter Pupkin poisoned." He perhaps hoped that the thing might lead to some kind of public inquiry, and that the question of Browning's poetry and whether it is altogether fair to allow of its general circulation would be fully ventilated in the newspapers. Thinking of that, Pupkin came to the main corner. On a warm August evening, the drugstore of Mariposa, as you know, is all a blaze of lights. You can hear the hissing of the soda fountain half a block away, And inside the store there are ever so many people, boys and girls and old people too, all drinking sarsaparilla and chocolate sundaes and lemon sours and foaming drinks that you take out of long straws. There is such a laughing and talking as you never heard, and the girls are all in white and pink and Cambridge blue. And the soda fountain is of white marble with silver taps, and it hisses and sputters, and Jim Elliot and his assistant wear white coats with geraniums in them, and it's just as gay as gay. The foyer of the opera in Paris might be a fine sight, but I doubt if it can compare with the inside of Elliot's drugstore in Mariposa for real gaiety and joy of living. This night the store was especially crowded because it was a Saturday, and that meant early closing for all the hotels except, of course, Smith's. So as the hotels were shut, the people were all in the drugstore drinking like fishes. It just shows the folly of local option and the temperance movement and all that. Why, if you shut the hotels, you simply drive the people to the soda fountains, and there's more drinking than ever. And not only the men, too, but the girls and the young boys and the children. I've seen little things of 8 or 9 that had to be lifted up on the high stools at Elliot's drugstore, drinking great goblets of lemon soda, enough to burst them, brought there by their own fathers. And why? Simply because the hotel bars were shut. What's the use of thinking you can stop people drinking merely by cutting off whiskey and brandy? The only effect is to drive them to taking lemon sour and sarsaparilla and cherry pectoral and Coroca cordial and things they wouldn't have touched before. So in the long run, they drink more than ever. The point is, you can't prevent people having a good time, no matter how hard you try. If they can't have it with lager beer and brandy, they'll have it with plain soda and lemon pop. And so the whole gloomy scheme of the temperance people breaks down anyway. But I was only saying that Elliot's drugstore in Mariposa on a Saturday night is the gayest and brightest spot of the world. And just imagine what a fool of a place to commit suicide in. Just imagine going up to the soda fountain and asking for 5 cents worth of chloroform and soda. Well, you simply can't, that's all. That's the way Pupkin found it. You see, as soon as he came in, somebody called out, "Hello, Pete," and 1 or 2 others called, "Hello, Pup," and some said, "How goes it?" and others, "How you toughin' it?" and so on, because you see, they had all been drinking, more or less, and naturally they felt jolly and glad-hearted. So the upshot of it was that instead of taking chloroform, Pupkin stepped up to the counter of the fountain, and he had a bromo seltzer with cherry soda. And after that, he had one of those aerated seltzers, and then a couple of lemon seltzers and a bromo fizzer. I don't know if you know the mental effect of a bromo seltzer, but it's a hard thing to commit suicide on. You can't. You feel so buoyant. Anyway, what with the fizzing of the seltzer and the lights and the girls, Pupkin began to feel so fine that he didn't care a cuss for all the Browning in the world. And as for the poet, to blazes with him. What's poetry, anyway? Only rhymes. So would you believe it? In about 10 minutes, Peter Pupkin was off again and heading straight for the Pepperleighs' house, poet or no poet. And what was more to the point, he carried with him 3 great bricks of Elliot's ice cream in green, pink, and brown layers. He struck the veranda just at the moment when Browning was getting too stale and dreary for words. His brain was all sizzling and jolly with the bromo seltzer, and when he fetched out the ice cream bricks and Zena ran to get plates and spoons to eat it with, and Pupkin went with her to fetch them, and they picked out the spoons together, they were so laughing and happy that it was just a marvel. Girls, you know, need no bromo seltzer. They're full of it all the time. And as for the poet, well, can you imagine how Pupkin felt when Zena told him that the poet was married and that the tubby little woman with her head on sideways was his wife? So they had the ice cream, and the poet ate it in buckets full. Poets always do. They need it. And after it, the poet recited some stanzas of his own, and Pupkin saw that he had misjudged the man, because it was dandy poetry, the very best. That night Pupkin walked home on air, and there was no thought of chloroform. And it turned out he hadn't committed suicide, but like all lovers, he had commuted it. I don't need to describe in full the later suicides of Mr. Pupkin, because they were all conducted on the same plan and rested on something the same reasons as above. Sometimes he would go down at night to the offices of the bank below his bedroom and bring up his bank revolver in order to make an end of himself with it. This, too, he could see headed up in the newspapers as, "Brilliant boy banker blows out brains." But blowing your brains out is a noisy, rackety performance, and Pupkin soon found that only special kinds of brains are suited for it. So he always sneaked back again later in the night to put the revolver in its place, deciding to drown himself instead. Yet every time that he walked down to the trestle bridge over the Ossawippi, he found it was quite unsuitable for drowning. Too high, and the water too swift and black, and the rushes too gruesome. In fact, not at all the kind of place for a drowning. Far better, he realized, to wait there on the railroad track and throw himself under the wheels of the express and be done with it. Yet, though Pupkin often waited in this way for the train, he was never able to pick out a pair of wheels that suited him. Anyhow, it's awfully hard to tell an express from a fast freight. I wouldn't mention these attempts at suicide if one of them hadn't finally culminated in making Peter Pupkin a hero and solving for him the whole perplexed entanglement of his love affair with Zena Pepperleigh. Incidentally, it threw him into the very center of one of the most impenetrable bank mysteries that ever baffled the ingenuity of some of the finest legal talent that ever adorned one of the most enterprising communities in the country. It happened one night, as I say, that Pupkin decided to go down into the office of the bank and get his revolver to see if it would blow his brains out. It was the night of the firemen's ball, and Zena had danced 4 times with a visitor from the city, a man who was in the 4th year of university and who knew everything. It was more than Peter Pupkin could bear. Mallory Tompkins was away that night, and when Pupkin came home he was all alone in the building, except for Gillis, the caretaker, who lived in the extension at the back. He sat in his room for hours brooding. 2 or 3 times he picked up a book. He remembered afterwards distinctly that it was Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and tried to read it, but it seemed meaningless and trivial. Then, with a sudden access of resolution, he started from his chair and made his way down the stairs into the office room of the bank, meaning to get a revolver and kill himself on the spot and let them find his body lying on the floor. It was then far into the night, and the empty building of the bank was still as death. Pupkin could hear the stairs creak under his feet, and as he went he thought he heard another sound like the opening or closing of a door. But it sounded not like the sharp, ordinary noise of a closing door, but with a dull, muffled noise, as if someone had shut the iron door of a safe in a room under the ground. For a moment, Pupkin stood and listened with his heart thumping against his ribs. Then he kicked his slippers from his feet, and without a sound stole into the office on the ground floor and took the revolver from his teller's desk. As he gripped it, he listened to the sounds on the back stairway and the vaults below. I should explain that in the Exchange Bank of Mariposa, the offices are on the ground floor level with the street. Below this is another floor with low, dark rooms paved with flagstones, with unused office desks, and with piles of papers stored in boxes. On this floor are the vaults of the bank, and lying in them in the autumn, the grain season, there is anything from $50,000 to $100,000 in currency tied in bundles. There is no other light down there than the dim reflection from the lights out on the street that lies in patches on the stone floor. I think as Peter Pupkin stood, revolver in hand, in the office of the bank, he had forgotten all about the maudlin purpose of his first coming. He had forgotten for the moment all about heroes and love affairs, and his whole mind was focused, sharp and alert, with the intensity of the night-time, on the sounds that he heard in the vault and on the back stairway of the bank. Straight away, Pupkin knew what it meant as plainly as if it were written in print. He had forgotten, I say, about being a hero, and he only knew that there were $60,000 in the vault of the bank below, and that he was paid $800 a year to look after it. As Peter Pupkin stood there listening to the sounds in his stockinged feet, his face showed gray as ashes in the light that fell through the window from the street. His heart beat like a hammer against his ribs, but behind its beating was the blood of 4 generations of loyalists, and the robber who would take that $60,000 from the Mariposa bank must take it over the dead body of Peter Pupkin, teller. Pupkin walked down the stairs to the lower room, the one below the ground with the bank vault in it, with as fine a step as any of his ancestors showed on parade. And if he had known it, as he came down the stairway in the front of the vault room, there was a man crouched in the shadow of the passageway by the stairs at the back. This man, too, held a revolver in his hand, and a criminal or not, his face was as resolute as Pupkin's own. As he heard the teller's step on the stair, he turned and waited in the shadow of the doorway, without a sound. There is no need really to mention all these details. They are only of interest as showing how sometimes a bank teller in a corded smoking jacket and stockinged feet may turn into such a hero as even the Mariposa girls might dream about. All of this must have happened at about 3 o'clock in the night. This much was established afterwards from the evidence of Gillis, the caretaker. When he first heard the sounds, he had looked at his watch and noticed that it was 2:30. The watch, he knew, was 3/4 of an hour slow 3 days before, and had been gaining since. The exact time at which Gillis heard footsteps in the bank and started downstairs, pistol in hand, became a nice point afterwards in the cross-examination. But one must not anticipate. Pupkin reached the iron door of the bank safe and knelt in front of it, feeling in the dark to find the fracture of the lock. As he knelt, he heard a sound behind him and swung round on his knees and saw the bank robber in the half-light of the passageway and the glitter of a pistol in his hand. The rest was over in an instant. Pupkin heard a voice that was his own, but that sounded strange and hollow call out, "Drop that or I'll fire!" And then, just as he raised his revolver, there came a blinding flash of light before his eyes, and Peter Pupkin, junior teller of the bank, fell forward on the floor and knew no more. At that point, of course, I ought to close down a chapter or volume, or at least strike the reader over the head with a sandbag to force him to stop and think. In common fairness, one ought to stop here and count 100 or get up and walk round the block, or at any rate, picture to oneself Peter Pupkin lying on the floor of the bank, motionless, his arms distended, the revolver still grasped in his hand. But I must go on. By 7:30 on the following morning, it was known all over Mariposa that Peter Pupkin, the junior teller of the exchange, had been shot dead by a bank robber in the vault of the building. It was known also that Gillis, the caretaker, had been shot and killed at the foot of the stairs, and that the robber had made off with $50,000 in currency, that he had left a trail of blood on the sidewalk, and that the men were out tracking him with bloodhounds in the great swamps to the north of the town. This, I say, it is important to note it, was what they knew at 7:30. Of course, as each hour went past, they learned more and more. At 8 o'clock it was known that Pupkin was not dead, but dangerously wounded in the lungs. At 8:30 it was known he was not shot in the lungs, but that the ball had traversed the pit of his stomach. At 9 o'clock it was learned that the pit of Pupkin's stomach was all right, but that the bullet had struck his right ear and carried it away. Finally, it was learned that his right ear had not exactly been carried away, that is, not precisely removed by the bullet, but that it had grazed Pupkin's head in such a way that it had stunned him, and if it had been an inch or two more to the left, it might have reached his brain. This, of course, was just as good as being killed from the point of view of public interest. Indeed, by 9 o'clock, Pupkin could be himself seen on the main street with a great bandage sideways on his head, pointing out the traces of the robber. Gillis, the caretaker too, it was known by 8, had not been killed. He had been shot through the brain, but whether the injury was serious or not was only a matter of conjecture. By 10 o'clock it was understood that the bullet from the robber's second shot had grazed the side of the caretaker's head, but as far as could be known, his brain was just as before. I should add that the first report about the bloodstains and the swamp and the bloodhounds turned out to be inaccurate. The stains may have been blood, but as they led to the cellarway of Netley's store, they may have also been molasses, though it was argued, to be sure, that the robber might well have poured molasses over the bloodstains from sheer cunning. It was remembered, too, that there were no bloodhounds in Mariposa, although, mind you, there are any amount of dogs there. So you see, by 10 o'clock in the morning, the whole affair was settling into the impenetrable mystery which it ever since remained. Not that there wasn't evidence enough. There was Pupkin's own story and Gillis's story, and the stories of all the people who had heard the shots and seen the robber. Some said the bunch of robbers go running past, others said walking past, in the night. Apparently the robber ran up and down half the streets of Mariposa before he vanished. But the stories of Pupkin and Gillis were plain enough. Pupkin related that he heard sounds in the bank and came downstairs just in time to see the robber crouching in the passageway, and that the robber was a large, hulking, villainous-looking man wearing a heavy coat. Gillis told exactly the same story, having heard the noises at the same time, except that he first described the robber as a small, thin fellow, peculiarly villainous-looking, however, even in the dark, wearing a short jacket. But on thinking it over, Gillis realized he had been wrong about the size of the criminal, and that he was even bigger, if anything, than what Mr. Pupkin thought. Gillis had fired at the robber just at the same moment as Mr. Pupkin. Beyond that, all was a mystery, absolute and impenetrable. By 11 o'clock, the detectives had come up from the city under orders from the head of the bank. I wish you could have seen the 2 detectives as they moved to and fro in Mariposa, fine-looking, stern, impenetrable men as they were. They seemed to take in the whole town by instinct, and so quietly. They found their way to Mr. Smith's hotel just as quietly, as if it wasn't design at all, and stood there at the bar, picking up scraps of conversation. You know the way detectives do it. Occasionally, they allowed 1 or 2 bystanders, Confederates perhaps, to buy a drink for them, and you could see from the way they drank it that they were still listening for a clue. If there had been the faintest clue in Smith's hotel, or at the Mariposa house, or in the Continental, those fellows would have been at it like a flash. To see them moving round the town that day, silent, massive, imperturbable, gave one a great idea of their strange, dangerous calling. They went about town all day, and yet in such a quiet, peculiar way that you couldn't have realized that they were working at all. They ate their dinner together at Smith's Cafe and took an hour and a half over it to throw people off the scent. Then, when they got them off it, they sat and talked with Josh Smith in the back bar to keep them off. Mr. Smith seemed to take to them right away. They were men of his own size, or near it, and anyway, hotel men and detectives have a general affinity, and share in the same impenetrable silence, and in their confidential knowledge of the weaknesses of the public. Mr. Smith, too, was of great use to the detectives. "Boys," he said, "I wouldn't ask too close as to what folks was out late at night. In this town it don't do." When those 2 great brains finally left for the city on the 5:30, it was hard to realize that behind each grand, impassible face, a perfect vortex of clues was seething. But if the detectives were heroes, what was Pupkin? Imagine him and his bandage on his head, standing in front of the bank, and talking of the midnight robbery with that peculiar false modesty that only heroes are entitled to use. I don't know whether you have ever been a hero, but for sheer exhilaration there is nothing like it. And for Mr. Pupkin, who had gone through life thinking himself no good, to be suddenly exalted into the class of Napoleon Bonaparte and John Maynard And the charge of the Light Brigade, oh, it was wonderful. Because Pupkin was a brave man now, and he knew it, and acquired with it all the brave man's modesty. In fact, I believe he was heard to say that he had only done his duty, and that what he did was what any other man would have done, though when somebody else said, "That's so when you come to think of it," Pupkin turned on him that quiet look of the wounded hero, bitter than words. And if Pupkin had known that all of the afternoon papers in the city reported him dead, he would have felt more luxurious still. That afternoon, the Mariposa court sat in enquiry. Technically, it was summoned in inquest on the dead robber, though they hadn't found a body, and it was wonderful to see them lining up witnesses and holding cross-examinations. There is something in the cross-examination of great criminal lawyers like Nivens of Mariposa, and in the counter-examinations of presiding judges like Pepperleigh, that thrills you to the core with the astuteness of it. They had Harry Mullins, the manager, on the stand for an hour and a half, and the excitement was so breathless that you could have heard a pin drop. Nivens took him on first. "What is your name?" he said. "Henry August Mullins." "What position do you hold?" "I am manager of the Exchange Bank." "When were you born?" "December 30, 1869. After that, Nevin stood looking quietly at Mullins. You could feel that he was thinking pretty deeply before he shot the next question at him. "Where did you go to school?" Mullins answered straight off. "The high school down home." And Nivens thought again for a while and then asked, "How many boys were at that school?" "About 60. "How many masters?" "About 3. After that, Nivens paused a long while and seemed to be digesting the evidence. But at last an idea seemed to strike him, and he said, "I understand you were not at the bank premises last night. Where were you?" "Down the lake duck shooting." You should have seen the excitement in the court when Mullins said this. The judge leaned forward in his chair and broke in at once. "Did you get any, Harry?" he asked. "Yes," Mullins said, "about 6. "Where did you get them?" "What? In the wild rice marsh past the river." "You don't say! Did you get them on the shit or how?" All of these questions were fired off at the witness from the court in a single breath. In fact, it was the knowledge that the first ducks of the season had been seen in the Ossawippi Marsh that led to the termination of the proceedings before the afternoon was a quarter over. Mullins and George Duff and half the witnesses were off with shotguns as soon as the court was cleared. I may as well state at once that the full story of the robbery of the Bank of Mariposa never came to the light. A number of arrests, mostly of vagrants and suspicious characters, were made, but the guilt of the robbery was never brought home to them. One man was arrested 20 miles away at the other end of Missinaba County, who not only corresponded exactly with the description of the robber, but in addition to this had a wooden leg. Vagrants with one leg are always regarded with suspicion in places like Mariposa, and whenever a robbery or a murder happens, they are arrested in batches. It was never even known just how much money was stolen from the bank. Some people said $10,000, others more. The bank, no doubt for business motives, claimed that the contents of the safe were intact and that the robber had been foiled in his design. But none of this matters to the exaltation of Mr. Pupkin. Good fortune, like bad, never comes in small installments. On that wonderful day, every good thing happened to Peter Pupkin at once. The morning saw him a hero. At the sitting of the court, the judge publicly told him that his conduct was fit to rank among the annals of the pioneers of Tecumseh Township, and asked him to his house for supper. At 5 o'clock, he received the telegram of promotion from the head office that raised his salary to $1,000 and made him not only a hero, but a marriageable man. At 6 o'clock, he started up to the judge's house with his resolution nerved to the most momentous step of his life. His mind was made up. He would do a thing seldom if ever done in Mariposa. He would propose to Zena Pepperleigh. In Mariposa, this kind of step, I say, is seldom taken. The course of love runs on through all its stages of tennis playing and dancing and sleigh riding, till by sheer notoriety of circumstance an understanding is reached. To propose straight out would be thought priggish and affected, and is supposed to belong only to people in books. But Pupkin felt that what ordinary people dare not do, heroes are allowed to attempt. He would propose to Zina, and more than that, he would tell her in a straight, manly way that he was rich and take the consequences. And he did it. That night on the piazza, where the hammock hangs in the shadow of the Virginia creeper, he did it. By sheer good luck, the judge had gone indoors to the library, and by a piece of rare good fortune, Mrs. Pepperleigh had gone indoors to the sewing room. And by a happy trick of coincidence, the servant was out and the dog was tied up. In fact, no such chain of circumstances was ever offered in favor of mortal man before. What Zina said, beyond saying yes, I do not know. I am sure that when Pupkin told her of the money, she bore up as bravely as so fine a girl as Zina would. And when he spoke of diamonds, she said she would wear them for his sake. They were saying these things and other things, ever so many other things, when there was such a roar and a clatter up Oneida Street as you never heard, and there came bounding up to the house one of the most marvelous limousine touring cars that ever drew up at the home of a judge on the modest salary of $3,000. When it stopped, there sprang from it an excited man in a long sealskin coat, worn not for the luxury of it at all, but for the sheer chilliness of the autumn evening. And it was, as of course you know, Pupkin's father. He had seen the news of his son's death in the evening paper in the city. They drove the car through, so the chauffeur said, in 2 hours and a quarter, and behind them there was to follow a special trainload of detectives and emergency men. But Pupkin Sr. had cancelled all that by telegram halfway up, when he heard that Peter was still living. For a moment, as his eye rested on young Pupkin, you would almost have imagined, had you not known that he came from the maritime provinces, that there were tears in them, and that he was about to hug his son to his heart. But if he didn't hug Peter to his heart, he certainly did within a few moments clasp Zina to it, in that fine fatherly way in which they clasp pretty girls in the maritime provinces. The strangest thing is that Pupkin Sr. seemed to understand the whole situation without any explanations at all. Judge Pepperleigh, I think, would have shaken both of Pupkin Sr.'s arms off when he saw him, and when you heard them call one another Ned and Philip, it made you feel that they were boys again attending classes together at the old law school in the city. If Pupkin thought his father wouldn't make a hit in Mariposa, it only showed his ignorance. Pupkin Sr. sat there on the judge's veranda smoking a corncob pipe as if he had never heard of Havana cigars in his life. In the 3 days that he spent in Mariposa that autumn, he went in and out of Jeff Thorpe's barber shop and Elliott's drugstore, shot black ducks in the marsh, and played poker every evening at 100 matches for a cent, as if he never lived any other way in all his days. They had to send him telegrams enough to fill a satchel to make him come away. So Pupkin and Zina, in due course of time, were married, and went to live in one of the enchanted houses on the hillside in the newer part of town, where you may find them to this day. You may see Pupkin there any time cutting enchanted grass on a little lawn in as gaudy a blazer as ever. But if you step up to speak to him, or walk with him into the enchanted house, pray modulate your voice a little, musical though it is, for there is said to be an enchanted baby on the premises, whose sleep must not lightly be disturbed. End of the Mariposa Bank Mystery by Stephen Leacock.
When a Man's Alone by Stanley Gardner, from Smart Set Magazine, April 1926. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothmann. The Story of the Desert and a Girl and the Red Front Cafe in Mexicali. When a Man's Alone by Stanley Gardner. Anyone who has done very much running around the country knows that the Red Front in Mexicali isn't exactly a young ladies' finishing school. Not in the sense of the word that is generally used in polite society anyway. Of course, that doesn't mean that a girl can't work in the Red Front and be straight. She can, but she won't get rich on the job. Ostensibly, the girls are entertainers who line up to the bar and ask the customers to buy them a drink. Once they get a sucker started, it's up to them to keep the drinks coming thick and fast. One of the great troubles with the Mexican border towns, from the standpoint of the owners of the resorts, is that the crowd comes over to look and see and listen, but not to do any great amount of spending. That's the reason they have entertainers. One of the reasons, anyway. Personally, I didn't have any business in the Red Front, and nobody knew it better than I did. A man who thinks one of these bar harpies is after anything except his money has got another think coming. But when a man's been out in the desert for 3 or 4 months without the sight of another human being, well, there's something about the warmth and the lights and the laughs of the girls that draws him inside and keeps him there. I knew this Jane with the black eyes and the red lips was simply leading me on to make a fool of myself, but I just didn't care. The gold dust was cashing in over the bar, had cost me lots of toil under the blistering sun, and the gold dust I was going to have to get to take its place when it was gone was going to come just as hard. I knew it, and I stayed on. I don't know why, unless it's because a man can only stand being away from a woman just so long. It wasn't this Jane with the black eyes. I didn't care a thing about her. It was just the idea of being able to feast my eyes on a woman, listen to her laugh, feel the touch of her hands once in a while. Oh, I can't explain it. I didn't realize what a fool I was making of myself until I got a glimpse of my mug in the bar mirror. I was looking and acting like a poor, driveling fool. I sort of came to myself with a shock and made up my mind to break away from there, and she read my mind and twined her arms around me, begging for just one more drink, her red lips sticking right up in my face. Her eyes so close I could see the little flecks of red running through the whites. Of course I ordered another drink, and then the bartender passed out one on the house. The girl decided she was going to give me one farewell drink before we left, and the next one was on her. Oh, I knew the game all right, but the point is, I didn't break away. I stayed there and played the sucker, even to ordering one last drink after the girl had treated. I just couldn't stand to have the girl to be the last to buy, and I'd been out in the desert 4 months. It was night. There was a cold wind blowing up from the desert, and I had a sensation of being carried somewhere through the dark. From a great distance came the sound of voices that registered in my mind, in spite of the fact that I didn't want them to. All I wanted was to be let alone, to drift off into the darkness. "It ain't fair," said a feminine voice. "He's played the game, and he didn't get fresh or anything. He's just an old stiff of a prospector who ain't seen anybody in a long time, and you can't—" The voice that interrupted was a man's. "Cut it out, kid. A couple of more wise cracks out of you, and you'll get a knife stuck in your ribs. You can't bump off a tourist that's got 1,000,000 friends on the other side of the border. You've got to take some old stuff like this that nobody'll miss. Mexican Joe wants a stiff that he can plant near the border with a bullet hole in his head and his pockets full of dope. And this bird comes nearest to being what we want." At this, another voice butted in. "What's the idea of the old codger, Bill?" There was a sigh. "Say, I ain't going to explain my business to every bird in the joint. Get over." Apparently, the man didn't get over. "I know your game. Mexican Joe has been running dope, and the officials are laying a trap for him. You're going to take this fellow out there, fill his pockets with dope, shoot him, and leave him for the officers to find, to divert suspicion from Mexican Joe." It was a voice that had the earmarks of education, and that interested me, but I wished they'd quit and let me drift on back. There was an oath, the sound of a blow, and then I was dropped. It was the bang of hitting the floor that woke me up. All of a sudden, those voices commenced to have a deep, personal significance. By an effort of will, I managed to open my eyes. Apparently, I was in a little shack somewhere on the outskirts of town. There was a wind blowing through the chinks in the rough boarding, and a dry cold, which comes on the desert when it does get cold. It was a rough board shack with a row of bunks on one side and a passageway leading off into the darkness. A Chinese was sitting cross-legged before a little lamp. His black eyes shifted back and forth. His claw-like hands fluttered around over an opium pipe. A woman was just rushing out the door as though she were going somewhere with a definite purpose in mind. And two men were having a free-for-all fight directly above me. One of them was heavy and strong. The other was slight and wiry. Nothing but a kid. While I looked up, trying to get my muscles working so I could grab a leg and bring hostilities down to me, the kid worked some sort of clever shift, flashed over a white fist, and knocked the other bird clean into the corner. Then he looked down at me. "Can you walk?" I managed to get my muscles working, and flopped up onto my hands and knees, and then to my feet. When I stood up, my head seemed to split in two pieces and rock back and forth. "Yep," I said. He led the way to the passageway. Then I understood. "Come on, then. The girl's gone after the gang, and Mexican Joe will have us marked inside of another 2 minutes. Mark my word." I would have nodded if it hadn't been for my head. The kid didn't need to tell me. I knew all about that border stuff. We started from the passageway. He knew the way, I didn't. It's a good thing it was that way. I couldn't have kept my feet if it hadn't been for his arm steadying me. At last we got outside, after going through 15 or 20 different turns and twists and doors. The cold air braced me a bit, but I had an awful head. He started to slip away. I stopped him. "You can't go over the border now. It must be after 9 o'clock. Mexican Joe will have a knife in you tomorrow morning if you stay on here in town." He shrugged his shoulders. I could feel his arms move up and down, careless-like. "I don't care. Just as soon go that way as any other." The voice sounded dead, sort of lifeless. I'd left my saddle horse and pack burros out on the border of town, and I knew Ah Gee, the old Chinese grocer, would have them all packed with provisions and be waiting for me. I'd played wise and paid him for the grub stake before I started into the red front. I'd been in Mexicali before. "Come on with me," I told this kid. "I'll hide you out for a while, and I've got a prospect that'll make you something better than wages." He didn't seem anxious to come, but he didn't protest. I figured it out that the dope was getting cold in his system and that he was groggy. I figured it right, too, for he sneaked off while I was getting the pack strung together, and then came back in a minute or two, full of pep. I didn't say anything. One of the packs I cached with Ah Gee. it left a burro that could be ridden. The saddle horse I turned over to the kid. I figured he wouldn't know much about riding. My head was getting clearer every minute. He was the one that'd be having the worst of it inside a couple of hours, but he didn't realize it. The dope was working, and I'd have a hard time to keep him on the horse and leave me with the burro. Riding a walking horse in the dark is a hard thing to do. The horse plods along slowly and steadily, and the darkness comes in on all sides, keeping a man hemmed in with a black cloak that follows right along with the horse. You can't see any scenery to keep your eyes and mind busy. The trail beneath the horse is just a blur of grayish white, and minutes get to seem like hours. The kid in front must have been hitting the dope pretty steady. He talked a lot. I learned that his name was Sidney Gleason and that he was from the East. And I learned all about every nook and hole in the wall south of the United States and north of Mexico City where a man could get hop. I didn't learn a blessed thing about what part of the East the kid came from, who his folks were, or where he'd been educated. I filed all that away as a significant fact and went on minding my own business, seeing that the pack train kept straight. By sunup, the kid was a wreck, and an hour after that, I had to stop and give him a rest. We didn't get into the Prospect until the afternoon, and it had become pretty hot before we got there, too. The kid had a fever, and I put him on a cot, wound a wet rag around his head, and unloaded the packs. That night, he did a lot of raving. There was some dope in his coat, and I took charge of it. I could see from the way he had ridden he was a tenderfoot. He'd been all around the towns in Mexico, but he hadn't been out of sight of an automobile or a wagon road very far. I guess he'd done most of his traveling by boat up and down the coast, hitting inland on the wagon roads. He sure knew a lot about some parts of Mexico. I took the horse down the hill a half a mile or so to a little spring. The burros I led back in the sage. They would take care of themselves, and I figured I could find them when I needed them. I was commencing to get a plan. Next morning, when the kid had come down to earth so that he could talk sense, I held a confab with him. Look here, Sidney, you and I can't put our noses in Mexicali again for a while. That means we've got to swing down to Ensenada for provisions. But it also means we've got to lie low for a while. You're a snowbird, and that's no use being sensitive about it. You've saved my life, and I've got to do what I can to save yours. If there's any way of getting a fresh supply of coke that doesn't leave us wide open to danger, I'd get it. I'm no reformer, but we're in here and can't get out without running the risk of getting killed by Joe's bunch. We know too much, and we've got the best of him, thanks to you, and Joe can't sit quiet and let us get away with it. Now, all this is leading up to the fact that I've taken your dope, and you've got to taper off. It'll be 4 or 5 weeks before it's safe to even go to Ensenada or try to make it back across the border. He looked at the floor, silent and sullen. All right, give me a pinch now. I suspected he'd had some in the night. He didn't seem so very fidgety. Not yet, I said. He acted quick, that boy. Before I knew what he was doing, he had an axe and was making a vicious swing at my head. He was clean nutty from too much dope the day before, and fearing he was going to get it taken away from him. I got the axe away from him. Damn you, he stormed. I don't want to taper off. I don't want to go through the hell of trying to quit. The game isn't worth it, and I can't quit. I've tried it before. I sat tight. I had to. He only had enough for 3 or 4 days on full rations. The next 3 weeks were simply hell. Twice he tried to kill me, and blame near made it stick the last time. Once he started out on foot across the desert, and he'd gone far enough to get his tongue swollen before I caught him with the horse. He'd started after dark, and I had a hard time catching up, after it got light enough to read the trail. Finally, I licked it. Gradually, he commenced to put on weight and to get a spring in his step. He was jumpy and morose for a while, but he finally worked out of it. I gave him a half interest in the mine and put the loads back in the 6-gun. That showed him that I trusted him anyway. From then on, he worked as hard as I did to get back in condition. The grub ran out after a month, and I had to make another trip for provisions. I didn't dare leave the kid alone there, and I hated to take him with me into the bright lights with the dope habit just barely licked and still showing fight. Then there was Mexican Joe. I put it up to him. "I'll go," he said. "I never figured anything was licked that you had to keep running away from." We packed into Ensenada, 5 days of it. There we learned that Mexican Joe had got his. They caught him red-handed, and he got croaked in the fight that followed. That simplified matters. The kid made a game fight on the dope, but he didn't last. Somewhere between the time I'd bought the grub and when I got the burros up and ready for packs, the kid lit out. There was an automobile stage that had left for Mexicali, and I learned that the kid had taken the stage. I got another car and followed, leaving the burros with some friends. All the time I was bumping over those abominable roads, I was cussing myself for not thinking of it before. There was a woman in the case, and I'd never even suspected it. He could have got dope in Ensenada. She wasn't the sort of woman he was proud of, or he would have told me about her. But he sure was wrapped up in her, or he wouldn't have given me the slip that way. I found the kid 2 hours after I got to Mexicali. Also, I found the girl. She was an entertainer in one of the dance halls. Sidney hung his head when I caught him. I called him outside. "Listen, kid," I told him, "pick up your head. There's nothing to be ashamed of about falling for a skirt. I've been young once, and I still fall for them. It isn't that alone. I come from a good family, and all right, maybe she comes from a good family too. You're both a hell of a long ways from home." That wasn't what I was said, steady-like. Then I knew he'd been hitting the dope again. "What I meant was I'd come from a good family, and I can't stop halfway. Either I've got to go all the way back, or else there's no use starting. When I got back here, well, things didn't seem any use. It's too far back to where I have to go. Pete, I've been hitting the dope." I didn't understand all of the speech, but I sure understood the last part of it. I was opening my mouth to speak when there came an avalanche of red drapes, and a red-headed thunderbolt drew up in front of me and began to give me hell. She figured I was trying to shame Sidney into leaving her alone, and she sure hauled me out high, wide, and handsome. I waited until she got most of it out of her system and was coming up for air. "All right, sister, now forget it. As far as you're concerned, you're Jake a million with me. What's eating me is that this sweetie of yours has fallen for the dope again. I thought I had him cured." "Cured?" The way she said it, I knew that she didn't know a thing about what the kid had been or what he had been doing. "All right," I said. "I ain't much for making speeches, but I'm making one now. The point is, do you like this kid, or is he a regular customer?" With that, I drew out a bag of dust. "If you're on the make, it's a question of getting the dough, and I'll give you a fair proposition for a complete release." As soon as I spoke, I knew it was a false lead. Whatever her game was, it wasn't dough. "All right, sister, all right, forget it. Now, here's the other angle. I can lick this dope habit with the kid's help, because we did it once. We're headed back into the desert, and if you really care for him, you'll help me head him on back." "Where to?" she asked. I told her the whole layout. The kid stood to one side, thoroughly ashamed of himself. She turned up her big gray eyes and drank it in. And you're not ashamed of me because I'm what I am? She motioned a hand back toward the dance hall, where the blare of discordant music was screeching forth into the night. Ma'am, you're one of my sort. Maybe we've seen the steamy side of things a bit, but as far as my standards are concerned, the only question is whether or not you're on the square with your friends. All right, then, I'm coming too. You're what? I'm coming too, she said. Sidney can't make it without me. We've got to keep him away from towns until he's got it all out of his system, and we can't do it as long as I'm in Mexicali. I looked at Sidney. He had perked his head up a bit, and his eyes were shining. Get your things, sister, I told her. I've got them, she said. We'll have to drive back to Ensenada to get the burros, I told her, as I led her over to the machine. The next day, I got to talk with her alone while Sidney was riding on ahead. I've got an idea that Sidney's family is pretty much upper crust, I told her. She nodded her head. Suppose he gets cured, I kept on boring in. He'll go back to his folks in the upper crust, way up. She nodded her head again. This time there was a tear running down one cheek. And that'll leave you here on the desert in Mexicali. He won't take you with him, you know. He couldn't. After all, the only thing that holds him to you is the dope. It was cruel, and I shouldn't have done it. But I had to know. Do you think I don't know that, you great big ignorant beast, you? A woman knows these things, without having to think of them. I tell you, I love him. Love him so much I'm going to help make a man of him again, even to lose him. Now, damn you, you've had your little say, and if you so much as open your mouth about it again, I'll tear every damn hair out of your head, you old buzzard. Wait a minute, I told her. I just had to know where you stood. Figure it out for a minute, and you'll see my position. I'm working for the kid. She thought for a minute. You win, she said, and then she swept her sleeve over her eyes. That was the beginning of her fight to make a man out of the fellow she loved. She knew that she was going to lose him if she beat the dope, but how she fought! About the time he was commencing to get control of himself again, there was a stranger came up to the shack. He was all in and a tenderfoot proper. He gave his name as Garver and made himself right at home for a couple of days while he was getting his wind. Out there in the desert, we don't ever ask a man his business, and he can stay as long as he wants. Just the same, a gentleman will volunteer a little something about himself and move on before he's dented the grub much. This man did neither. He was tall and thin, and his skin was sort of mummified, but he had a pair of eyes that glittered right through you. He was riding a horse that had cost somebody some money, and he had his clothes done up in a sheet on the back of the saddle. He didn't have any blankets, and he wasn't a good enough rider to have come through in a day. Someone had guided him to within a few miles of the shack, and then turned him loose. The girl didn't like him and showed it. I kept my feelings to myself and did him the honors of the desert. The fourth day he faded, and I heaved a sigh of relief until I noticed that he'd left his clothes all done up in the sheet and stuck under his bunk. I didn't like that. After thinking things over, I saddled up and started on his tracks, and I had my 6-gun with me. 4 miles out of Mexicali, the horseman jogged back, and something about the way he bounced about in the saddle made me limber up the holster of my 6-gun. It was Garver. I rode up alongside. He pretended a lot of pleasure, which was false, and a surprise, which wasn't. I jerked out the 6-gun and started ruffling up his shirt front with the front sight. All right, come clean. He was an attorney from New York. Old man Gleason had employed him to find Sidney, and he'd trailed the kid over half the United States. But he'd struck a hot trail when he came to Mexicali. With unlimited money, he'd managed to corral all the information he needed. He'd come on in to send a wire to old man Gleason. He had a reply, but he kept it to himself. Threatening to blow the daylights through his stomach didn't scare him badly enough to make him kick through with the wire. Knowing him as I did, I could figure what was in the telegram. He was trying to graft a few thousand. Made him kick through with all the dope on the old man, though. He was a big gun in the railroad circles, in the financial end. I started on into Mexicali. He called me back. Of course, on behalf of my client, I realize that young Sidney is in a rather doubtful position, one which will require some delicate handling. And as I said, on behalf of my client, I am in a position to make you a substantial cash offer for your cooperation in forgetting all about the past few weeks. You understand what I mean by the word forgetting? I was so sore I cut his horse over the rump with my rope. The lawyer spilled himself out onto the sand with the first jump. I figure he'd be busy for an hour or so chasing the horse, so I rode on in. I went across the line into Calexico. From there I put in a phone call to old man Gleason in New York. I got Gleason in less than 2 hours. A secretary tried to head me off, but I explained what I wanted to Central and told her what I'd pay for and what I wouldn't, and finally the old man himself came on the line. I want you to take the next train out here. I'll meet you in Calexico. Can you leave tonight? Who are you? He asked. I am the only friend your son's got anywheres around this end of the line, I came back. My name is Pete Rodney. Do you know my attorney, Mr. Garver? He asked. I answered in 3 words, like a book. I'll leave tonight, said the voice on the receiver, and there was a snap to it that I liked. Meet me at Calexico. Register in one of the hotels, the best, and wait for me. I'll be there, I said. And reverse the charges on this call, he added as he hung up. I liked that bird from then on. Old man Gleason showed up on schedule. I wasn't at the hotel. I met the train. Right away I spotted him. Gleason? I asked. Rodney? He inquired. I nodded. We both looked at each other for a minute, and then his eyes softened. His hand came out. Glad to know you. When and where do we talk? We don't talk. I can't tell it, not here anyway. Maybe I could tell something of it around a campfire, but I'm not a talker, and this is something I can't spoil by trying to tell it. He looked right through me and then nodded again. When do we start? Right away. I've got some horses. I can ride, he said. He was right. He sat a horse like he was made for it. He had on riding clothes when he climbed off the train. None of those tailor-made dude outfits, but some regular He-Man clothes. We rode all afternoon and didn't say a word. That night we were within 10 miles of the cabin when it got dark, but I commenced to feel as though I could talk. I stopped, unsettled, and built a small fire, and fried up some bacon and boiled a little coffee. He sat down on the sand and dug into the grub as though it hit the spot. The stars burned down steadily, and the silence commenced to creep around us like a blanket. It's a woman, I said after a while. He didn't say anything. A woman and dope, I went on. She loves him enough to give up everything, and she doesn't know who he is. How do you know she loves him? She's trying to make him give up dope, and she knows that his folks are way up, and she's a dance hall girl. I don't see what that proves. The hell you don't. Think it over. I didn't at first, but I'm not educated. Figure you're in her place. The man you love is a dope fiend. That's keeping him away from his family. You're a dance hall girl. Are you going to try to cure him? He sat silent for a long while, looking at the coals. Then he got up. How far is it? About 10 miles, I told him, and then started after the horses. There were lights on in the cabin as we came up. The sand muffled the horses' feet, and we shuffled up without a sound. In front of the door was another horse, the reins hanging over his head. I felt his flanks. They were still wet. Within, there was a sound of a man's voice rolling out as though he were making a speech. I opened the door a bit, not knowing what was inside. Old man Gleason was standing at my elbow. Garver, the lawyer, had the floor. There was just himself and the girl in the cabin. It has taken me all this time to get a word with you alone, he boomed like he was making a speech to a jury. Sidney Gleason must leave. The time has come that society reclaim its own. I feel that I am not violating any confidence in telling you that young Mr. Gleason comes of a very prominent family. On behalf of my client, who shall be nameless, I must return Mr. Gleason to his, family. Have I your cooperation or not? I have felt it since I saw you. Yes, he can go now. He is cured. The lawyer nodded. That is fine. I have here a draft for $10,000. It will assist you to, forget. That was as far as he got. You cad! You dirty cad! I have been a dance hall girl, yes, but I've been square. I've been straight, and I barely made enough to get my meals and clothes, and I've been insulted by every rounder south of the Canadian border. You and your forgetting. Bah! I'll give you something to forget, you damn shyster. I'm Sidney Gleason's wife. We were married in Mexicali before I knew anything about his family. And when I was damned because I was a dance hall girl, and he was damned because of his dope. Outcasts of society, thrown together and married under Mexican law. I thought he wouldn't stop the dope, and those weeks that followed were the happiest of my life. Then Pete Rodney took him away and nearly cured him. When Sidney came back to me, Rodney followed and told me Sidney had been almost cured. That was the night I knew my happiness was doomed. I lied to him about the marriage, told him it was irregular and simply a joke I played on him. I've worked and slaved and broken my heart for the moment when I could give him back to his family, when I could give my man back to the world that belongs to him, and blast my soul for doing it. And they have sent a damn buzzard-necked shyster out here after him that offers me money. There was a motion beside me, somebody crowding me against the door. Old man Gleason's shoulder pushed me against the door until he nearly broke me in two. Then he advanced to the red-headed fury with his arms open. Daughter, he said. She looked at him sort of dazed-like. Who are you? I'm Sidney's father. Meet my new daughter. She pushed away from him. You don't savvy, she said listlessly. I'm a dance hall girl. He swept her to him. You're just the girl I've always wanted Sidney to marry. You're going to stay with us, Sidney and me. Good God, girl, can't you see that Sidney can't live without you? And I wouldn't want him if he could. It'll take you to keep him straight. Once more I was crowded into the wall, and Sidney broke into the room. Father! I stole a look at the lawyer. He was running his Adam's apple up and down his throat, getting ready to say something. Get out! Vamoose! You're finished, I told him. And that's why your horse is starting for Mexicali tonight, with you on him. And I'm going to be hanging on to the lead rein just to make sure you don't get lost in the dark. The end of When a Man's Alone by Stanley Gardner.